All right, hi, welcome back to the Pandemic University podcast. So before I get started with the actual episode, once again, if I want to reiterate, I still don't have my all of my files with like my intro music and stuff I edit with, so that's still missing. But I talk about a lot of topics here, so like this is kind of a trigger warning and kind of an introduction because this is a long episode. But yeah, trigger warning. I discuss like rape and brutality and stuff if you can't really handle that. Also, this episode, I mention a lot of things, and if you take the time to look it up, because I don't really like talk about it clearly enough, which is why I'm recording this intro. But if you don't know about these topics, I highly recommend you look them up. I talk about redlining. The Contract Buyers League is something that's important, which I suggest you look up. It's about black people who wanted home ownership. I mention a story, and I'm reiterating this here because it's important, about a man who goes on a bulldozer rampage, but I don't like specify the story because I can't remember the full details. But there is a news story like a couple years ago. A Colorado man bulldozes, goes on a rampage through the city because, like, he's being legally screwed over so they could buy up all his property so they could build infrastructure on it. And I say it in the episode, but I'm just going to say it again here. Like, I bring up this story to talk about how, I mean, if you look this up, right, and you go to YouTube or news pages and you read the comments, people are going like, this is what happens when you screw over a hardworking American man. And I mentioned the story to say, like, the sympathy that white people get for destructive actions when the government or realtors or corporations screw them over, the sympathy that they get seems, it's foreign. Like, black people don't get that same sort of sympathy. You know, we get, historically and even now, we get called vandals and all sorts of things. But we've received this treatment long before white people did. So I'm just, like, this intro is just to try to elucidate some of the things that I bring up that I don't talk about too clearly during the episode. But yeah, I definitely recommend you look some of these stories up. Yeah, this episode, like, it hits a lot. And I think it's important. So please listen through the whole thing. Thank you again for listening to the podcast. Yeah, and I hope you enjoy it. It's I've been okay. I don't know how to start this. That's what's weird about this one. So my first module of college, I took a class called Political Theory, which is just a political philosophy course. We read a bunch of Plato. We read some Socrates, a whole lot of Aristotle. And then there's John Locke and, God, who else? Rousseau. We didn't read Hobbes as required by the class, but, you know, I ended up reading some Hobbes. We got into some modern political theorists. And now I'm taking this human geography course. And the first thing that we have to read for the course is this thing called, this article that was written for The Atlantic, can't remember what year, called The Case for Reparations, written by this guy, Ta-Nehisi Coates. And first and foremost, let me say, like, I am against many forms of sort of reparations as they've been presented to me for Black Americans in America. Would I have been against them? I don't know. In the early 20th century, in the 19th century, well, I wasn't born there, but I think no. But as of right now, I am, because I don't see a reasonable way to implement it that's practical and that wouldn't lead to more divide in the country, especially after the Trump presidency. Like, talking about reparations at this point, I mean, first of all, the like, minorities as a whole in this country are growing in population. Not to say that their financial well-being is better, but just to say that, like, I don't know, given 30, 40, 50 years, we're going to see a closer 50-50 of, like, white people and minority groups. And I say that to say, like, reparations, again, like, that's not going to sound too good to, as Dave Chappelle put it, the tiki torch whites. And even your moderate white people. I don't think they'd be for that either. And so my stance against it is just that the implementation would be too impractical. And, I mean, Congress it's never, like, any sort of bill for reparations has never made it to the House. There's just no way to do it without either it being, like, blocked or causing a huge stir that would lead to violence, especially as the white population starts to feel more and more disenfranchised, which, again, after the Trump presidency, like, you can see that they already do, and the potential racial violence that can come from that. So that's why I've been against it. But after reading some of this article about the case for reparations, I can see where it makes sense. There needs to be like a very specific way to implement it, though, which I will talk about sort of my way of wanting to go about that. But I guess, like, I don't know, like, you know about the atrocities that happened, and slavery ended, what was that, 1865? Okay, I was going to say 68. Yeah, so slavery ended in 1865. But, we know that there's still the 90 years of, like, Jim Crow era, and which went up until the 1940s and then 1950s, right? And there's all the sort, and even though slavery ended, lynching still happened until the 30s in some places, into the 40s in some others, Mississippi. So here we are 80 years out of slavery, and people, like black people, are still being lynched and hanged. So, my grandma was born in what was she born in, the 50s? So she was definitely around to see some like awful stuff happen. I'll start here, right? And I'm going to tie this all back together because my mind's kind of everywhere with this. But when people talk about, like, when black people tend to talk about the atrocities that's happened against them and how it's like negatively affected us as a community, as a population. And then I say the less well-read of black folks will always say, we need this because of slavery. And then obviously the less well-read of white folks will go, slavery ended what will be 200 years ago in 2060. Everything's all fine and dandy. It's like just pointing it back to slavery doesn't really break down the nuance of everything that happened. So I think like when both groups bring it up, they're kind of missing the point. But when reading, this article, The Case for Reparations, something that I didn't realize was sort of, and I mean, it's been brought to more light for me as of recently, but the things that were done to the slaves that trickled down into familial dynamics and cultural behaviors, I say cultural in quotation marks, of black people, like the trickle down effect of that is huge. Like, I'm just reading, and I don't know why this never came to my attention, or I guess I knew, but I never connected the dots. White slave owners took black families and ripped them apart. So a lot of these kids didn't grow up knowing their fathers and their mothers. And I will recommend this. There's this like history sort of mockumentary series called Roots. It's like 4 episodes. It's about Kunta Kinte. It's very hard to watch. I sat through 3 episodes. I think there are 4 of them. I had to stop on one of the episodes because there was a rape scene in it, and that kind of did it for me. I was like, yeah, no more of this. But what's interesting to me, and like I've seen more TikToks. I don't have TikTok, by the way. I refuse to get the app. It's just a personal choice. But I've seen like a lot of TikTok activists, and they talk about sort of where black stereotypes came from. And with some of them, I'm like, all right, but the meanings of these have been lost, so it's not that big a deal. Like with the watermelon thing. But then when I hear about the whole like black families being ripped apart, and you see that there's this like major stereotype where black kids don't have their fathers around. The origin of that, when you think back to it, they used to rip black families apart. And then during the sort of great migration between like the 30s and the 60s or the 40s and the 70s, depending on where you draw that window, where black people moved from the south to the north looking for a better life. And then up in the north, government, white people, white business owners did everything in their power to make black people's lives as hard as possible. One of the things that they did, was have mass incarceration rates of black folks. They moved jobs out. They redlined their neighborhoods, especially like when you think about it this way, right? And this is something else that the author of the Atlantic article wrote about. You're a black man in the 40s, in the 30s and the 40s. They are still lynching y'all in the South. They're beating you. If you still work for somebody, they're essentially treating you as a slave, even in 1930, right? So you go, I'm taking my family to the north. You're a husband. You have your wife. You have your however many kids. You move up there and you look for a job, and you're like, oh, great, I have a job. It doesn't pay much, but I can take care of my family, right? The whole thing, right, is you want to take care of your family, right? That's been instilled in you. So you go to do that, and then you go looking for property, and they won't sell you a mortgage. So you have to rent out a house that's already been bought, that's already been owned. You'll never be able to buy it because they keep hiking the prices up on you. You want to move to a different neighborhood, but they won't sell you in a different neighborhood. The mortgage keeps going up on your place. You can no longer afford this house. You need more work. They move your job out. And the government stops funding, or funding as a whole, not even just the government, funding to your neighborhood just stops, right? Or let's say if, you're in this property you're renting, your landlord just evicts you for no reason, or like they find a reason, they make up a reason to just kick you out. So you move somewhere, I don't know, projects, for instance. I don't know what they would have been called back then. And funding stops going there. And now they've moved your job out. And now you're this man with your family that you have no way to take care of. And here you are coming to the north thinking, I would have been able to do it. And you can't. So then what do, right? As a dad, you need to feed your family. The hard-working, pull yourself up by the bootstraps American goes, just find a job. But they won't give you a job. They move the jobs out of your neighborhood. You're not allowed to be in other neighborhoods because segregation is still very much a thing, even if it's not as blatant. What do? As a dad, it's frustrating. You might turn to crime or you might start, I don't know, like rage leads people to do things. Like when they feel like the whole of society is against them, and we see this time and time again, rage leads people to go and commit violent acts, and then they might get arrested. Like there was a dude, this is recent history, this is like the last decade or so, a white guy who, I think they were trying to do construction on his property. This is a very like popular story. And so he took a machine and like he took one of the construction machines and destroyed everything, right? I wish I knew the story. Maybe someone listening will know the story. But yeah, these contractors or something, or maybe it was the government. They like literally decided to start a project on his property. He fought for years to try to get them to not do it, but they did it anyway. So out of rage, because he did all this fighting and the system just would not help him, he took I think it was a bulldozer, and he just bulldozed everything. And everyone online was in support of this guy. They were like, "Oh yeah, this guy, you took everything from him. He's frustrated. The system didn't support him." Supporting this white dude for destroying property, right? Destroying property because he's felt disenfranchised. Let's go back to my, and this story sounds like a hypothetical. It's in this article. So this has happened. So you go back to this dad now who can't work, who can't feed his family, who doesn't have a home. He rages out. He lashes out against against the people, against society for doing this to him. Now he goes to jail. Now white people demonize him as a black violent criminal. Well, now these black kids don't have their dad. What do you expect to happen? And I bring up, the story in the 30s just because I know I started way back with slavery and how they ripped apart families, but how many black men grew up without fathers? Because first their fathers were ripped away from them by force, and then when slavery ended, their fathers were ripped away from them by society doing everything in their power to make these men powerless. I don't know, like, that's deep. That's deep. When you connect those dots and you look like at how far back these things go and like these patterns, yeah, you just start to realize like how deep that actually is and how far back it goes and how the pattern has continued for so long. And yeah, I guess like, I don't know, the last 50 years, just as a whole, like like black people getting to start their own businesses and their own companies and start to make fortunes for themselves. You see examples of black exceptionalism and point that to like, oh, okay, well, just black people are doing better. We're still like, as a whole, as black people in general, the average like middle class black family is still so much poorer than the average middle class white family. But like all that aside, it's just, I don't know, seeing these connections as far back now and like realizing it in school, it's, I don't know. I still don't know how I stand on reparations. Well, let me get to that now. Let me explain. Well, I'll explain that in a sec. Yeah, I'll explain that. So, in terms of, and like, I'm beginning to see why people bash on capitalism as it is like an institution in the United States. I kind of get it. But, with reparations, if they were to be done, unfortunately, well, no. First off, it cannot be done in the form of money. There's too many problems with that, both logistically and societally, where that wouldn't work. You can't just go giving black people money. Who do you give the money to? How do you figure out which family was hurt the worst, right? Like black people's history in this country, as far as like individual records, well, I mean, we didn't get birth certificates for the longest time because we weren't considered citizens. So how do you trace back like whose mom or whose dad or whose family had their property taken? And then who do you trace it to? And then what family do you trace it to? And like, then you go, okay, is that family responsible? Now, do they even know where they got this wealth? And then like, okay, well, then does the government redistribute wealth? And how does that work? And once again, who gets the money and who doesn't? Some black families are really well off and some aren't, but should the really well off families get money if they don't need it? It's one of those things. So monetary reparations just wouldn't work. I think when we talk about